Homeless man talks to a tree every day. What people learn about that tree is devastating. Every morning, at exactly 7:30 a.m., residents of Maple Street in downtown Denver would see the same homeless man sitting beneath the large oak tree in Riverside Park, talking quietly to its trunk as if it were an old friend. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with graying hair and weathered clothes, and he would spend hours each day in animated conversation with the ancient tree that had stood in the park for over a century. Most people who passed by assumed the man was mentally ill, talking to himself or experiencing hallucinations that made him believe the tree could hear him. Some would hurry past, uncomfortable with the sight of someone who seemed disconnected from reality. Others would shake their heads in pity, viewing him as another casualty of a system that had failed to provide adequate mental health care. But Margaret Foster, a retired teacher who lived in an apartment overlooking the park, had been watching the homeless man for 3 months, and she noticed something that others missed. The man's conversations with the tree weren't random or incoherent. They followed patterns, had emotional depth, and seemed to bring him genuine comfort and peace. Margaret had taught elementary school for 35 years, and she had learned to observe human behavior carefully. What she saw in the homeless man's interactions with the tree wasn't madness, it was grief, love, and a deep connection that transcended normal understanding. "Good morning, sweetheart," the man would say each day as he settled against the tree's massive trunk. "I brought you some water today. I know you're thirsty." Margaret watched as the man would carefully pour water from a plastic bottle around the tree's roots, then sit back and begin what appeared to be a one-sided conversation about his day, his memories, and his hopes for the future. One particularly cold October morning, Margaret decided to approach the man. She had been a teacher long enough to recognize when someone needed help, and something about his devotion to the tree touched her heart in a way she couldn't explain. "Excuse me," Margaret said gently as she approached the man. "I'm Margaret. I live in that building over there, and I've noticed you spend a lot of time with this tree." The man looked up with startled eyes, clearly surprised that someone was speaking to him. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering anyone. I can move if you'd like." "You're not bothering anyone," Margaret assured him. "I was just curious about your tree. It's beautiful." The man's expression softened, and for the first time, Margaret saw him smile. "She's beautiful, isn't she? She's been here longer than any of us. She's seen so much, heard so many stories." "What's your name?" Margaret asked, settling down on a nearby bench. "Robert," the man replied. "Robert Chen, and this is my Sarah." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "You're Sarah?" Robert's eyes filled with tears as he placed his hand on the tree's bark. "My wife Sarah was her name. She loved this tree, loved this park. We used to come here every weekend when we were young." Margaret realized that Robert wasn't talking to the tree because he was mentally ill. He was talking to it because it represented a connection to someone he had lost, someone who had meant everything to him. Margaret spent the next hour listening as Robert shared the story of his life with Sarah, their love affair that had begun in this very park 40 years earlier, and the tragedy that had led to his current circumstances. Sarah had been a nurse, Robert an accountant, and they had built a comfortable middle-class life together in Denver. "We met right here," Robert said, patting the ground beneath the oak tree. "I was reading a book, and she was feeding the squirrels. She asked me what I was reading, and we ended up talking for 3 hours. I knew that day that I was going to marry her." Robert and Sarah had been married for 38 years, and they had made the oak tree a central part of their relationship. They had their first kiss beneath its branches. Robert had proposed their and they had returned every year on their anniversary to sit together and remember how their love had begun. "Sarah always said this tree was magical," Robert explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She said it had witnessed so much love over the years that it had become a repository of all the happiness that had happened beneath its branches." Margaret listened with growing understanding as Robert described how Sarah had been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease at the age of 62. The progression had been rapid and devastating, stealing away the brilliant, compassionate woman Robert had loved for decades. "She forgot everything else," Robert said quietly, "but somehow she always remembered this tree. Even when she didn't recognize me, she would ask to come here. It was the only place where she seemed peaceful." Robert had cared for Sarah at home for as long as possible, but eventually, her condition required specialized care that he couldn't provide. The medical bills and the cost of the memory care facility had consumed their savings, their retirement fund, and eventually their home. "I lost everything trying to take care of her," Robert said without bitterness, "but I'd do it again in a heartbeat. She was worth everything I had to give." Sarah had died 6 months ago, and Robert had been living on the streets ever since. He had no family, no support system, and no resources to rebuild his life. But he had the tree, the one constant connection to the love that had defined his existence for 4 decades. "I come here every day to talk to her," Robert explained. "I tell her about what I've seen, what I've learned, how much I miss her. Sometimes I read to her from books I find. She always loved it when I read to her." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the depth of Robert's loss and the profound love that kept him anchored to this spot. He wasn't homeless because of addiction or mental illness. He was homeless because he had sacrificed everything for love and had nowhere else to go. "Robert, where do you sleep at night? Where do you eat?" There's a shelter about 6 blocks from here, Robert replied, but I have to be back here early in the morning. I don't want Sarah to wake up alone. Margaret realized that Robert's entire life now revolved around maintaining his connection to Sarah through the tree. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to enduring love and a tragedy of loss and isolation. Robert, would you mind if I visited you and Sarah again tomorrow? I'd like to hear more about her. Robert's face lit up with joy. You'd want to hear about Sarah? Most people think I'm crazy for talking to a tree. You're not crazy, Margaret said firmly. You're a man who loved his wife so much that you can't bear to let go of your connection to her. That's not madness, that's devotion. Margaret returned to the park the next morning with a thermos of hot coffee and some homemade muffins. She found Robert in his usual spot, gently brushing fallen leaves away from the base of the tree. Good morning, Robert. Good morning, Sarah, Margaret said, addressing both Robert and the tree. Robert's smile was radiant. Sarah, this is Margaret. She's a teacher, and she wanted to meet you. Margaret played along, understanding that this ritual was Robert's way of keeping Sarah alive in his heart and mind. It's lovely to meet you, Sarah. Robert has told me wonderful things about you. Over the following weeks, Margaret made visiting Robert and Sarah part of her daily routine. She learned more about their life together, how Sarah had worked in pediatric nursing because she loved children, how Robert had taught himself to cook her favorite meals, how they had traveled together to small towns across Colorado, always returning to their special tree. She had this laugh, Robert said one morning, his eyes distant with memory. It was like music, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. When she laughed, everyone around her would start smiling, even if they didn't know why. Margaret began bringing other things to share with Robert and Sarah, books to read aloud, flowers to place at the base of the tree, and stories from her own life as a teacher. She found that talking to the tree, even knowing it was symbolic, brought her a sense of peace and connection that she hadn't expected. You know, Margaret told Robert one day, I think Sarah was right about this tree being magical. There's something special about this place. Margaret had also started researching the history of the oak tree, curious about its significance in the park. What she discovered was remarkable. The tree had been planted in 1923 as a memorial to soldiers who had died in World War I, and over the decades, it had become an unofficial gathering place for people seeking comfort and connection. Robert, did you know that this tree was planted as a memorial? It's been a place where people come to remember loved ones for over a century. Robert looked at the tree with new understanding. So Sarah and I weren't the only ones who felt its power. Other people have brought their love and grief here too. Margaret had also been quietly working behind the scenes to help Robert. She had contacted social services, researched housing options for seniors, and looked into benefits that Robert might be eligible for as a widower. But she was careful not to pressure him, understanding that his connection to the tree was what was keeping him emotionally stable. Robert, I've been thinking about your situation. There might be some resources available to help you get back on your feet. Robert looked conflicted. Margaret, I appreciate everything you've done for me, but I can't leave Sarah. This tree is the only connection I have left to her. What if I told you that you didn't have to choose between getting help and staying connected to Sarah? Margaret had discovered a senior housing complex just 4 blocks from the park, with a waiting list that she was trying to help Robert navigate. The location would allow him to maintain his daily visits to the tree while having a safe, warm place to live. You could still come here every day, Margaret explained. You could still talk to Sarah, still take care of the tree, but you'd have a real home to go to at night. Robert was hesitant, but Margaret could see that months of living on the streets were taking a toll on his health. He had developed a persistent cough, and his arthritis was getting worse from sleeping on hard surfaces. I'll think about it, Robert said finally. But I need to ask Sarah what she thinks. That evening, Margaret watched from her apartment window as Robert had what appeared to be an intense conversation with the tree. She couldn't hear his words, but she could see the emotion in his gestures and posture. The next morning, Robert greeted Margaret with news that would change everything. I talked to Sarah last night, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She told me that she wants me to take care of myself, to find a way to live again, instead of just surviving. Margaret felt a surge of relief and excitement. Robert, that's wonderful. Sarah loves you and wants you to be safe and healthy. But there's something else, Robert continued, his expression growing serious. Sarah told me something about the tree that I need to share with you, Robert explained, that during his conversation with the tree the previous evening, he had noticed something he had never seen before. Carved into the bark, barely visible beneath decades of growth, were initials and dates that told the story of other couples who had found love and solace beneath the oak's branches. There are dozens of them, Robert said, running his fingers over the faint markings, couples who carved their initials here, dates going back 50 years or more. This tree really has been a witness to love stories for generations. Margaret examined the carvings with growing amazement. There were indeed numerous sets of initials, some so old they were barely discernible, others more recent. Each one represented a love story, a moment of connection, a promise made beneath the protective canopy of the ancient oak. Robert, this is incredible. This tree isn't just special to you and Sarah, it's been special to couples for decades. But As they continued to examine the tree more closely, Margaret noticed something that made her heart sink. The oak tree, despite its majestic appearance, was showing signs of serious disease. The bark was discolored in several places. Some of the upper branches appeared to be dying, and there were areas where the wood looked soft and compromised. "Robert, I think we need to have someone look at this tree. It doesn't look healthy." Margaret contacted the city's parks department and requested that an arborist examine the oak tree. When the specialist arrived 2 days later, his assessment was devastating. "This tree is severely diseased," the arborist explained to Margaret and Robert. "It has advanced oak wilt, and the infection has spread throughout the root system. I'm afraid it's beyond saving." Robert's face went white with shock. "What does that mean?" "It means the tree is going to die," the arborist said gently. "In fact, it's dangerous to leave it standing. The disease has weakened the structure, and it could fall during the next major storm. We're going to have to remove it within the next few weeks." Robert collapsed against the tree's trunk, sobbing with a grief that was both fresh and familiar. "They're going to take Sarah away from me again," he whispered. "I'm going to lose her all over again." Margaret knelt beside Robert, her own heart breaking for his pain. "Robert, listen to me. Sarah isn't in this tree. Sarah is in your heart, in your memories, in the love you carry with you every day. No one can take that away from you." But Robert was inconsolable. The tree had been his anchor, his connection to the past, his reason for getting up each morning. The thought of losing it felt like losing Sarah all over again. "I don't know how to live without her," Robert said through his tears. "First I lost Sarah, then I lost our home, and now I'm going to lose the only thing that connects me to her." Margaret held Robert as he grieved, understanding that this moment represented more than just the loss of a tree. It was the final severing of his connection to the life he had built with Sarah, the last tangible link to their shared history. "Robert, we're going to figure this out together," Margaret promised. "Sarah's memory doesn't depend on this tree. We're going to find a way to honor her that will last forever." In the days following the arborist's devastating diagnosis, Margaret threw herself into finding a way to help Robert cope with the impending loss of the tree, while also honoring the significance of what it had meant to so many couples over the decades. Margaret had an idea that she hoped would provide comfort to Robert while preserving the legacy of the oak tree. She contacted the local historical society, the parks department, and several community organizations to propose creating a memorial garden in the spot where the tree stood. "This tree has been a witness to love stories for over a century," Margaret explained to the city council during a public meeting. "Instead of just removing it and planting grass, we should create something that honors all the couples who found meaning beneath its branches." Margaret's proposal included preserving sections of the tree's trunk to create memorial benches, establishing a small garden with plaques that told the stories of some of the couples who had carved their initials in the bark, and creating a space where people could continue to come to remember loved ones. "Robert and Sarah's story is just one of many," Margaret told the council. "This tree has been a sacred space for generations of people who needed a place to connect with love and memory." The community response to Margaret's proposal was overwhelming. When the local newspaper published the story of Robert and Sarah along with the history of the oak tree, hundreds of people came forward with their own memories of the tree and offers to help with the memorial project. "My grandparents had their first date under that tree in 1952, one woman wrote. "They were married for 63 years, and they always said that tree was where their love story began. My husband proposed to me there in 1987, another person shared. "We've been bringing our children and grandchildren to visit that tree for decades." The stories kept coming, each one adding to the understanding of how significant the oak tree had been to the community. Margaret compiled them into a book that would be part of the memorial, ensuring that the tree's legacy would be preserved even after it was gone. Robert was initially resistant to the memorial project, still grieving the loss of his direct connection to Sarah, but as he heard the stories of other couples who had found meaning beneath the tree, he began to understand that Sarah's memory was part of something larger and more enduring. "Maybe Sarah was right about the tree being magical," Robert said as he and Margaret read through the collected stories. "Maybe it really did collect all the love that happened beneath it, and now that love is going to live on in a different way." Margaret had also been working with social services to secure housing for Robert in the senior complex near the park. The waiting list had moved faster than expected, and a small apartment had become available. "Robert, you can move in next week if you want to," Margaret told him. "You'll be close enough to visit the tree site every day, and you'll be here to help with the memorial garden as it's being built." Robert looked at the tree, which was showing more signs of disease each day. Some of the upper branches had already fallen, and the parks department had cordoned off the area for safety reasons. "I think Sarah would want me to take the apartment," Robert said finally. "She always worried about me taking care of myself, and maybe she'd like knowing that I'm going to help create something beautiful in her memory." The tree removal was scheduled for the following month, giving the community time to say goodbye and for Robert to prepare emotionally for the transition. Margaret organized a series of farewell gatherings where people could share their memories and leave flowers at the base of the tree. "This isn't an ending," Margaret told the crowd that gathered for the final farewell ceremony. This is a transformation. The tree's physical presence is ending, but its spiritual presence is going to live on in the memorial garden and in all of our hearts. Robert spoke at the ceremony, sharing the story of his love for Sarah and how the tree had sustained him through his darkest period. His words moved many people to tears, but they also inspired hope for the future. Sarah taught me that love doesn't end when someone dies, Robert said. It just changes form. This tree is going to change form too, but the love it witnessed and protected is going to continue in the memorial garden and in all of us who are touched by its presence. 1 year later, Robert stood in the Sarah Chen Memorial Garden, surrounded by blooming flowers, memorial benches carved from the oak tree's trunk, and plaques that told the stories of dozens of couples who had found love and solace beneath the ancient tree's branches. Robert had not only moved into the senior housing complex, but had become the volunteer coordinator for the memorial garden, spending his days tending the flowers, greeting visitors, and sharing the stories of the tree and the people it had touched. "Good morning, sweetheart," Robert said, just as he had every morning for over a year. But now he was speaking to a beautiful garden instead of a dying tree. "Look how many people came to visit you today." The memorial garden had become a popular destination for couples, families, and individuals seeking a peaceful place to remember loved ones. The centerpiece was a large plaque that told the story of the oak tree and included a quote that Sarah had once shared with Robert: "Love is the only thing that grows when it's shared." Margaret visited the garden every day, often finding Robert there with visitors who wanted to hear the story of the tree and the couples it had witnessed. Robert had become something of a local celebrity, featured in newspaper articles and television segments about the power of love and memory. Robert has become the guardian of all these love stories. Margaret told a reporter who was writing a follow-up article about the memorial garden, "He's turned his own grief into a way of honoring everyone who has ever found comfort in this place." Memorial Garden had also sparked a citywide initiative to identify and preserve other significant trees and natural spaces that held special meaning for the community. Robert had become an advocate for this effort, understanding that nature often serves as a repository for human emotion and memory. Trees and gardens don't just provide beauty, Robert explained to the city council during a presentation about the preservation initiative. They provide connection to the past, to each other, to the natural world that sustains us all. Robert had also reconnected with some of Sarah's former colleagues from the hospital where she had worked. They had established a small scholarship fund in Sarah's name for nursing students who wanted to specialize in pediatric care, ensuring that her legacy of caring for children would continue. "Sarah would be so proud of everything that's grown from her memory," one of her former colleagues told Robert. "She always believed that love had the power to heal and transform, and that's exactly what's happened here." The memorial garden had become a place where Robert could share his story with others who were dealing with grief and loss. He had become an informal counselor, offering comfort and wisdom to people who were struggling with the death of loved ones. "The hardest thing about losing someone you love is feeling like they're really gone," Robert would tell visitors. "But I've learned that love doesn't die. It just finds new ways to express itself." Sarah's love lives on in this garden, in the people who visit here, in the stories we share about her. Margaret had documented the entire journey in a book about the oak tree, the couples it had witnessed, and the memorial garden that had grown from its legacy. The book had become a bestseller, with proceeds going to support the maintenance of the garden and similar memorial projects in other cities. Robert and Sarah's story shows us that love really is eternal. Margaret wrote in the book's conclusion, "It may change form, it may find new expressions, but it never truly ends." The oak tree that witnessed their love is gone, but the love itself lives on in the garden, in the community that rallied to preserve its memory, and in every person who visits this place and feels the power of enduring connection. Robert had also started a support group for widowed seniors, meeting weekly in the community center near the memorial garden. The group provided a space for people to share their grief, their memories, and their hopes for finding meaning after loss. "Grief is the price we pay for love," Robert would tell the group members. "But it's a price worth paying, because love is what makes life meaningful. Our job isn't to get over our grief, it's to learn how to carry it with grace and find ways to honor the people we've lost." As Robert reflected on his journey from homeless widower to community advocate and guardian of love stories, he was amazed by how much his life had changed since that first morning when Margaret had approached him beneath the oak tree. "I thought my life was over when Sarah died," Robert said during a speech at the Memorial Garden's first anniversary celebration. "I thought the only thing left for me was to sit beneath that tree and wait to join her. But I learned that love gives us work to do, even after the people we love are gone. Sarah's love gave me the strength to help preserve this place, and to share our story with others who need hope." Robert's story reminds us that love transcends physical presence, that grief can be transformed into purpose, and that sometimes the most beautiful memorials are the ones that grow from the ashes of lost. It shows us that everyone has a story worth preserving, and that the connections we make with others, whether human or natural, can sustain us through even the darkest times. Most importantly, it proves that love really is eternal, finding new expressions, and touching new lives long after its original source has passed away. And that sometimes the most profound healing comes from helping others find their own connections to love and memory. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the enduring power of love and the importance of preserving the places and memories that matter most, please subscribe to our channel. We share stories of hope, transformation, and the incredible ways that love finds new expressions, even in the face of loss. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that every love story deserves to be remembered, and that the most beautiful memorials are the ones that keep love alive for future generations.